Determining quadrants based on signs of trig ratios. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the easiest quadrant of all of them, the first quadrant. Every trig ratio is positive in the first quadrant. Once we leave the first quadrant, that's when you can possibly get some negatives and some positives. But everything is positive in the first quadrant, so we're going to start there. In quadrant number 2, only sine and its reciprocal, cosecant, are positive in the second quadrant. Moving down into quadrant 3, tangent and its reciprocal are positive. Moving into quadrant 4, cosine and its reciprocal of secant. So everything is positive in the first quadrant. That's everything here. Everything here is positive in the first quadrant. Only sine and cosecant are positive in the second quadrant. Only tangent and cotangent positive in the second quadrant. And then cosine and secant are positive in the fourth quadrant. So my first question, in what quadrant is sine and cotangent both positive? So when I'm asking this, I want to know in which quadrant are both of these true at the same time. So if we think about it, only in quadrant 1 will both of these be positive at the same time. Sine is positive in the first quadrant and cotangent is positive in the first quadrant. So to answer this question, sine and cotangent are both positive in quadrant number 1, Q1. So we are still focusing on identifying the quadrant based on signs of trig ratios. So now I have something that says, okay, what if sine theta is positive, that's 3/5, positive 3/5, and tangent is less than 0? I always say, let's start first with identifying the times your functions are positive. So this will be the function that I focus on first. And what I would do then is go ahead and mark the two quadrants that I know sine is positive in. Luckily, automatic, quadrant 1, everything is positive. And from a previous video, we did in the second quadrant, we also determined that sine and its reciprocal were both positive in the second quadrant. So just based on knowing that sine is positive, you only have two options now. I'm either going to be in quadrant 1 or I'm going to be in quadrant 2. From there, we can move on and focus on the tangent. And if tangent is less than 0, then that means I have to be now in quadrant 2. Because remember, everything is positive in quadrant 1. So I have determined the quadrant, quadrant 2. All right, so now I'm going to make a small adjustment. I'm going to make another XY axis. Now this time, I'm going to have sine theta be a negative 3/5 and tangent theta is going to be less than 0. This time you have to think about it and ask yourself, when is this function, when is sine theta negative? We know sine is positive in quadrant number 1 and quadrant number 2. This means sine will be negative in quadrant number 3 and quadrant number 4. And just as before, we can now focus on tangent, and we know tangent is positive in the third quadrant. So tangent will be negative in quadrant number 4. for both of these to be true at the same time, I have to be in quadrant number 4. All right, so let's do a quick recap over everything that I've gone over so far. Number 1, it's always good to know exactly when your trig ratios are positive. Now, if this is a little bit too confusing, there's another way that you can remember them, and I remember it by the acronym by saying all students take calculus. Now, A stands for all. S stands for sine, but remember, it is also sine and its reciprocal. So if you can remember sine, then you should know what the reciprocal is. Those will be the two things that are positive in the first quadrant. T stands for tangent, which is this one, but not only tangent is reciprocal. C stands for cosine, but this is not only for cosine, it's for cosine and its reciprocal. So everywhere the function goes, so does its reciprocal. So if sine is positive somewhere, its reciprocal will also be positive in that same place. So now that we know all students take calculus, that's what we can bring over here when we start to figure out which quadrant do we select just by knowing signs of the trigonometric ratios. This example, we see that sine is positive, and sine is positive 2 places, in quadrant 1 and in quadrant 2. So those are the only 2 things I should be thinking about for this function. Once I have those, then I can come over here to tangent and think about, okay, when would it be negative? Can't be in the first quadrant because everything's positive there. Therefore, we know tangent will be negative here. So both of these are true at the same time in quadrant 2 based on these descriptions. It's the same approach here. The difference with this example is both of my descriptions were negative. So sine is negative in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. And we know that because the other 2 are when they're positive. So now that I know that I could either be in quadrant 3 or I can be in quadrant 4, I can now read what this says and then make the selection. Tangent is positive in the 3rd quadrant, so that means in quadrant 4 is when tangent is also negative. So these 2 functions are true based on these descriptions only in quadrant 4. So we're going to find the value of cosine theta and cotangent theta. But that's if, and this is a very big if. This is where it gets very important. That's if sine theta is negative 4/5 and secant is less than 0. So how do we start on this? Number 1, you always want to go with some information that you know. So we know that the sine values have particular variables to go along with it. That's the y and that's the r. That's the y and that's the r. So if I know that much, I at least know that I can do a Pythagorean identity to get the x value. So my x value, I don't know, but my y value, I know that's a -4. And my r value is a 5. So what we're looking at is x squared plus 16 is equal to 25. And remember, you subtract 16 on both sides. That gives us a 9. That gives us an x squared. So that means This is true if x is equal to 3. So we know what x is. But there's something that most people do skip over that I find very important. The important thing is to draw your diagram. Determining the quadrant is what is important, believe it or not. So when is sine negative? We know sine is positive in quadrant 1 and 2, which means this will be negative in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. And this one also asks that secant is negative. Secant is positive in quadrant 4 along with its reciprocal cosine. So that means I must be in quadrant 3. This is why I emphasize diagrams are important, because I know that the radius or the r value is 5. I know that the y value is -4. But notice down here when I did my Pythagorean identity, I have x is equal to 3. But if I'm in quadrant 3, I can't have a positive x value. I really have a negative x value if I'm going in this direction. Remember, positive 3 sits over here. That's a positive 3. Negative 3 would sit back this way. So it's very important that we have a diagram, because a diagram will force you to get your signs correct on the x and on the y. What I also didn't mention is technically when you take a square root like we do over here, your true answer is plus or minus 3. And so if we don't take that into consideration, we are more likely to get a problem just like this incorrect, because that's a small detail that makes a world of difference. All right, so let's get back to answering what it wants us to figure out. Now, I have my diagram. My diagram is here. I know now that my x is really a -3. And now that I have everything listed, I know what my x value is. I know what my y value is. I know what my r value is. Now I have enough information to answer cosine and cotangent. And remember, cosine of theta is x over r. In this case, it's a -3 over 5, because we're looking directly on the triangle now. And then cotangent theta, by definition, is x over y. So x is a -3 and y is a -4. And what's a negative divided by a negative? A positive. So we have the two things that we were asked to find from the very beginning. And it all makes sense now, because in the third quadrant, tangent and cotangent are positive. And if we look here, my cotangent is positive. My cosine is negative, which is very true now that we're in the third quadrant. And those are all the examples that I wanted to go into today. Remember, everything starts from knowing that all students take calculus. That's going to help you remember everything. All students take calculus. That lets you know when things are positive. From there, we can move right over into this area here and start using what we know about the signs to determine which quadrant is the correct quadrant. All right. Which brings us to a question more like this one. If you can determine what quadrant you are in, that helps you draw your diagram, and your diagram will help you keep all of your signs intact. And everything from here on out is just based off of your regular definitions. I have that in another video, but I will write them down one last time. We have sine theta, cosine theta, tangent theta, y over r, x over r, y over x. Do not divide by 0. We have cosecant, that's r over y. Don't divide by 0. We have secant, that's r over x. Don't divide by 0. And then we have cotangent, x over y. Do not divide by 0. And that's everything. That is everything. That's how you determine quadrants based on your signs of your trig ratios.